Hey there. Ready to dive into something fascinating? We're about to take a whirlwind tour through the history and evolution of psychology.
And it's going to be a wild ride because we're not just talking Freud and therapy. We're
Mhm.
going way beyond that.
Right. We're going to uncover the surprising ways psychology shows up in our everyday lives.
It's woven into everything.
Okay, so buckle up because we're about to uncover how this field went from philosophical pondering to, rigorous experiments.
Oh, and get this. It's been shaped by everything from social movements to global conflicts, even wars.
Wars. Wow. Okay, so not your typical Psych 101 lecture then.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
And the best part is we'll connect those historical threads to what we understand about the mind today.
So we'll get the full picture, like how'd we get here? I'm in.
We'll be diving into things like cognitive psychology,
Okay.
the psychology of cultural groups,
Interesting.
and even how research studies are designed.
It's amazing to think that when most people hear psychology, they picture therapy sessions or lab rats running through mazes.
Right, those images are just a snapshot.
Exactly.
But,
So where did this field begin? What was psychology before all that?
well, what's fascinating is that psychology wasn't always about therapy or experiments.
Really?
Yeah, in its early form, it was deeply intertwined with philosophy.
Philosophy.
Yeah, back then it was often referred to as mental and moral philosophy.
So instead of collecting data, early psychologists were wrestling with big existential questions.
Precisely. They were grappling with stuff like the nature of consciousness,
Mm.
free will, morality, the heavy stuff.
Wow, so topics you'd find in a philosophy seminar, not a psychology lab.
Exactly.
That makes sense. So how did we get from pondering these big questions to the more, I don't know, scientific methods we see today?
That shift was driven by a few key factors. First, there was a growing desire for psychology to have real-world applications.
Like practical uses.
Exactly. People wanted to use this knowledge to solve problems,
Makes sense.
particularly in areas like education and social reform.
So it's like they wanted psychology to move from the armchair to the streets, to
Yeah.
make a tangible difference in people's lives.
Exactly. This desire for practical solutions, it was really connected to what some historians call the American moral project of social change.
The moral project.
Yeah, this idea that psychology, it could be a tool for improving society and solving social problems scientifically.
I never thought about it that way.
And it's a theme we see popping up again and again throughout the history of psychology in America.
That's really interesting. So psychology wasn't just driven by, intellectual curiosity, but also by this desire to make a real impact.
100%.
It makes you wonder about those early days when psychology was shifting from philosophy to science. Did everyone agree on the best way to study the mind? Or were there different schools of thought, competing for dominance?
Oh, there were definitely some heated debates.
I bet.
3 distinct models of psychological research kind of emerged during those early years. One prominent approach was introspectionism, championed by Wilhelm Wundt.
Wundt. He's often considered the father of experimental psychology, right?
That's the one. He's famous for those introspection experiments.
Yeah. I remember that from my Psych 101 class.
It wasn't just about having people reflect on their thoughts, though.
It wasn't.
No. Wundt was incredibly meticulous in his approach.
Oh, I see.
He established these very strict guidelines for how introspection should be conducted. It wasn't just a, free-flowing stream of consciousness, but a very structured way to try to understand the contents of the mind.
So he was trying to bring some scientific rigor to the study of, inner experience.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And here's an intriguing detail. Wundt didn't actually believe that all mental processes could even be studied through introspection.
Really? Huh.
He felt that higher mental functions, like language and reasoning, those were best understood by analyzing culture and history.
So he was recognizing the limitations of his own methods. That's interesting.
He explored those other ideas in his other major work, Volcker Psychology.
Wow. So he wasn't just a scientist, but also a bit of a philosopher himself.
Precisely. Wundt's work really shows how he was a product of his time and place, deeply rooted in that German intellectual tradition,
Which valued.
which valued both scientific experimentation, but also philosophical and cultural analysis.
Fascinating. But he wasn't alone on this journey of discovery, right?
Right. Ready to hear about a completely different approach.
Absolutely. Tell me more.
Okay, so while Wundt's team was peering inward, another group of researchers took a fascinating approach. Comparative psychology.
Comparative psychology. What's that?
Well, driven by Darwin's ideas about evolution, they turned their attention to animal minds, hoping to kind of unlock the secrets of human consciousness through comparison.
So instead of asking people to describe their thoughts, they were observing animals.
Exactly. Looking for clues about the evolution of mental abilities.
Interesting. Who are some of the big names in comparative psychology?
Two key figures in this field were George Romanes and C. Lloyd Morgan.
Okay.
They relied heavily on anecdotes.
Anecdotes.
Yeah, observing animal behavior in natural settings and then drawing inferences about their mental processes.
But inferring mental states from behavior, that seems like a tricky business. How can you really know what's going on in an animal's mind?
You've hit on the central debate of this approach.
Have I?
Yeah, there were concerns about anthropomorphizing animals.
Anthropomorphizing. You mean like projecting human-like thoughts and feelings onto them?
Exactly. Morgan, in particular, urged caution against these projective inferences. He advocated for more rigorous interpretations of animal behavior.
Right, because it's like trying to understand a different culture. You can't just assume their behaviors mean the same thing they do in your culture.
Precisely.
It makes you realize how challenging it is to study something as complex as the mind, even in humans, let alone other species.
You're spot on. And that challenge sparked a lot of skepticism about animal consciousness.
Oh, I bet.
It raised questions about, the validity of comparing human and animal minds at all.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It is. But this comparative approach, despite its limitations, was crucial in laying the groundwork for fields like animal cognition and evolutionary psychology.
And those fields are still going strong today.
Stronger than ever.
It's fascinating how those early explorations, even the ones that were maybe a bit flawed, continue to shape our understanding of the mind today.
Absolutely.
But we've only scratched the surface, right?
Right.
You mentioned 3 approaches. What was the third path these early psychologists were exploring?
The third path, this one was championed by William James and John Dewey.
Okay.
They called it adaptational psychology.
Adaptational psychology, okay.
And it was deeply, deeply influenced by, Darwinism and the American philosophical movement of pragmatism.
Okay, so while the first 2 approaches were focused on what the mind is, this one sounds like it's more about what the mind does.
100%. Adaptational psychology emphasized the function of consciousness, how it helps us adapt to our environment,
Okay.
make decisions,
I see.
and achieve our goals.
So instead of like dissecting the structure of the mind, they were interested in understanding its purpose, how it helps us navigate the world.
You got it.
Yeah.
They were less interested in, those controlled lab experiments and more focused on observing behavior in natural settings.
Real world stuff.
Exactly. Trying to understand how mental processes played out in the messy, complex real world.
That's fascinating. It sounds like this approach foreshadowed fields like evolutionary psychology and behavioral ecology.
It did.
What I find particularly intriguing is this link to pragmatism. How did that philosophical movement influence the direction of psychology?
Oh, pragmatism was huge.
Yeah.
And with its emphasis on the practical consequences of ideas and their usefulness in solving problems, it was a major force in shaping American psychology.
So it aligned with that moral project we discussed earlier. That belief that psychology could be used to create positive social change.
It fit in perfectly.
It's like a perfect storm of ideas.
It really was.
So we have these 3 distinct paths. Introspectionism, delving into the structure of consciousness, comparative psychology, exploring the evolution of minds, and adaptational psychology, focusing on the function of consciousness in our daily lives.
3 very different approaches.
It makes you wonder which path would ultimately capture the imagination of the field.
Well, each approach definitely left its mark. But adaptational psychology, with its emphasis on practicality and real-world applications, that one truly resonated in the American context.
Yeah, it's like it tapped into that American spirit of innovation and problem solving.
Exactly.
But how did this desire for like applied psychology actually take shape? Did anything pave the way for its acceptance?
Well, before psychology really took hold, there was another science of the mind that had captured the public imagination.
Really? And what was that?
Phrenology.
Phrenology. You mean the practice of analyzing skull shapes?
That's the one.
Oh, wow. I remember seeing those ceramic heads with different sections mapped out.
Exactly.
That's wild. It might seem outlandish now.
It does.
But in the 19th century, phrenology was considered a legitimate way to understand someone's character, abilities, even their potential for criminal behavior.
Can you imagine?
It's hard to believe people took it seriously.
I know, but they did.
But how did this rather unscientific practice pave the way for applied psychology?
Well, phrenology, for all its flaws, it kind of primed the public to believe that the mind could be studied,
Okay.
measured,
Right.
and potentially improved upon. So when psychology emerged, promising more scientific methods and, practical solutions, it landed on fertile ground.
So in a way, phrenology, with all its quirks, helps set the stage for the rise of applied psychology. It's amazing how even seemingly outlandish ideas can sometimes pave the way for new ways of thinking. But as we're about to learn, this path of applied psychology wasn't without its ethical challenges.
Yeah, and those ethical challenges, well, they're a crucial part of the story as we kind of delve into this particularly complex chapter, the rise of mental testing and its connection to the eugenics movement.
It's a stark reminder that even with the best intentions, scientific findings can be, well, twisted and used to serve really harmful agendas.
100%.
Yeah.
It's crucial to understand this historical context because it reveals how even seemingly objective psychological findings, they can be used to justify social inequalities.
So how did mental testing get so entangled with eugenics? It's a chilling thought.
It really is. It began with Sir Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin.
Okay.
Brilliant statistician, but he was obsessed with measuring human traits, particularly intelligence.
And he's the one who actually coined the term eugenics, right? This whole idea of like selective breeding to improve the human race.
Exactly. Galton believed that intelligence was largely hereditary and that society could be improved by, encouraging the fittest individuals to reproduce while discouraging those deemed unfit.
Wow. It's kind of dehumanizing when you think about it, reducing human beings to mere statistics. It's like
Yeah.
you're judging their worth based on these arbitrary standards.
And sadly, Galton's ideas, they resonated with some psychologists at the time.
They did.
Yeah, including James McKeen Cattell, who actually brought mental testing to America.
Cattell was also a proponent of eugenics. So how did that play out in his work?
Well, Cattell believed, like Galton, that intelligence could be objectively measured. And his tests were used for everything from evaluating, school children's abilities to assessing the fitness of immigrants, which had devastating consequences.
So psychology was being used not just to understand differences between people, but to rank them, to determine their place in society.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
And this is where it takes a darker turn. Fueled by these mental tests, the eugenics movement advocated for policies that were, well, discriminatory and inhumane.
Like what were some of the real life consequences of this movement?
One of the most horrifying examples is the Immigration Act of 1924. It imposed quotas on immigration based on ethnicity and national origin.
And those quotas were influenced by these biased intelligence tests.
Precisely. The tests were skewed to favor certain groups, reinforcing existing prejudices and painting entire groups as, intellectually inferior. It's a stark reminder of how even seemingly objective scientific tools can be used to uphold existing power structures, to discriminate against marginalized communities.
It's heartbreaking to see how a field that aims to understand the human mind could be used to justify such injustice.
It really is a dark period in psychology's history, but one we absolutely must acknowledge. And it didn't stop there. The eugenics movement also advocated for forced sterilization of individuals labeled as feeble-minded.
It's hard to believe that such horrific practices were actually carried out in the name of science.
It's a stark reminder that we must always be critical of how scientific findings are used and to challenge their misuse, especially when they target vulnerable populations.
Absolutely. It's a responsibility that falls on all of us. So we've seen how social and political forces really shaped the early development of psychology, often in troubling ways. But how did events like the two world wars impact the field?
The world wars, they had a profound impact on psychology, both in terms of, its practical applications and its status as a profession. During the wars, psychologists were called upon for a variety of tasks.
So psychology was seen as a valuable asset to the war effort.
Exactly. Psychologists were needed for personnel selection, training, even boosting morale among the troops.
Wow.
Yeah, and this led to the development of new psychological tools and techniques, many of which we still use today.
So out of, the turmoil of war, psychology found new purpose and applications.
Yes. The Army Alpha and Beta tests, for example, were developed to assess the intelligence of millions of recruits.
Millions. Wow.
These large-scale intelligence tests, while flawed in their assumptions and applications, they played a significant role in establishing psychology's ability to measure individual differences.
It's fascinating how, even in the midst of global conflict, this pursuit of understanding the human mind continued.
And this pursuit was further fueled by the wars themselves. The demand for trained psychologists, it just soared leading to the growth of professional organizations,
Like,
like the American Psychological Association, or APA.
okay, so the wars, in a way, both underscore the importance of psychology, but also highlighted the need for ethical guidelines and professional standards.
Exactly. This period marked a turning point for psychology. It gained recognition as a legitimate and essential field. But this wasn't the end of psychology's evolution. New schools of thought were emerging.
New schools of thought.
Yeah, each challenging existing assumptions and offering new ways of understanding the human mind.
And one of the most significant shifts was the rise of behaviorism, a school of thought that really dominated American psychology for decades.
Absolutely. Behaviorism kind of emerged in the early 20th century, and it radically shifted the focus of psychology.
So what were the key principles of behaviorism, and how did it differ from those earlier approaches we discussed?
Okay, so behaviorism, championed by psychologists like John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, they argued that psychology should focus exclusively on observable behavior.
Okay, so instead of trying to unravel the mysteries of consciousness, behaviorists were more interested in what they could actually observe and measure, the concrete stuff.
Exactly. They believed that internal mental states, things like thoughts and feelings, those were irrelevant to the scientific study of behavior.
Really?
To them, the mind was a black box. Interesting, perhaps, but ultimately unknowable.
It was outside the realm of their scientific inquiry.
100%.
Wow. So it was all about studying the relationship between stimuli, the things we encounter in our environment, and our responses, those observable reactions.
Precisely. Behaviorists, they believe that all behavior, no matter how complex, could be explained by the principles of learning, particularly through conditioning.
So our behaviors were seen as like learned responses to our environment, shaped by rewards and punishments.
Exactly. And behaviorism, despite its controversial rejection of internal mental states, had a massive impact on psychology. It really brought a new level of rigor to the field, with a strong emphasis on controlled experiments and objective measurements.
So in a way, behaviorism helped to solidify psychology's identity as a science.
Absolutely. Behaviorism's emphasis on observable behavior and measurable outcomes, it aligned perfectly with the scientific ideals of the time,
Right.
but it also faced criticism, for its very limited view of human experience.
Yeah, it's like they were so focused on the mechanics of behavior that they kind of missed the richness and complexity of our inner lives.
That was a major critique.
Yeah.
And despite its dominance, behaviorism, well, it couldn't hold back the tides of change forever.
Right, things were changing.
Yeah, new discoveries and a growing dissatisfaction with behaviorism's limitations, it led to what we now call the cognitive revolution.
Ah, yes, the cognitive revolution. It sounds like a dramatic turning point. Was it a sudden upheaval or more of a gradual shift?
It was more like a gradual rumbling that eventually, erupted into a full-blown revolution. By the mid-20th century, cracks began to appear in behaviorism's seemingly impenetrable facade.
What were some of the factors that contributed to this shift?
One major factor was just that behaviorism, for all its rigor, it struggled to explain complex mental phenomena,
Like,
like language, problem-solving, and creativity, things that are uniquely human.
right, it's like trying to explain the northern lights just by analyzing the chemical composition of the atmosphere. You're missing the magic, the awe-inspiring complexity of the phenomenon itself.
Exactly. And as scientists in other fields made groundbreaking discoveries, psychology found itself with these new tools and metaphors for understanding the mind.
Okay.
The mid-20th century, it witnessed a surge in, computer science and information theory. And that had a profound impact on how we viewed the human mind.
Right. It's like the invention of the computer gave us this new language for understanding our own internal processors. Did we start thinking of the brain as a kind of computer?
Precisely. The computer, with its ability to, process information, store memories, and execute complex operations, it became this powerful analogy for understanding the human mind. We started talking about information processing, mental representations, cognitive maps.
So instead of seeing the mind as like a passive recipient of environmental stimuli, we began to appreciate its active role in, shaping and interpreting information.
Exactly. And this shift was further fueled by groundbreaking work in linguistics, particularly the research of Noam Chomsky.
Chomsky's work on language was revolutionary. He challenged the behaviorist view that language was simply a matter of learned associations, right?
Absolutely. Chomsky argued that we're actually born with an innate capacity for language, a kind of universal grammar hardwired into our brains.
Wow, so this challenged the very foundations of behaviorism.
It did. It suggested that some aspects of our mental life are not simply products of our environment, but rather products of our biology.
It's like discovering a hidden room in an old house, a room filled with this intricate machinery that had been silently operating all along, shaping our thoughts and actions.
That's a great way to put it. Chomsky's work opened up all these new avenues for exploring the mind,
Wow.
revealing a level of complexity that behaviorism just couldn't adequately explain.
So the cognitive revolution was more than just a shift in focus. It was like a complete overhaul of how we thought about the mind.
Absolutely. It brought mental processes back to the forefront of psychology, and it really paved the way for this, deeper understanding of how we think, learn, remember, and make sense of the world around us. But that, as they say, is a story for our next deep dive. It really was a revolution in how we understand ourselves. It's like finally being able to peek behind the curtain and explore the intricate machinery of thought itself.
It's like trading a simple hand-drawn map for a sophisticated GPS system. But this new understanding of the mind also raised some pretty profound questions about the nature of psychology itself, didn't it?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
As psychologists delved deeper into the complexities of cognition, they began to question the very idea of psychology as a purely objective science, separate from the influences of culture and society.
It's like realizing that the mapmaker's own perspective, their biases and assumptions are actually woven into the very fabric of the map. So how did this realization change the way psychologists approach their research?
Well, it led to this surge of new perspectives that really challenged traditional psychological assumptions. For example, feminist psychology kind of emerged as a powerful critique of the male-dominated field,
Interesting.
highlighting the ways in which research had often ignored or minimized women's experiences.
It's like realizing that half the world's population was using a map that didn't accurately represent their journeys or destinations. So how did feminist psychologists challenge these biases and try to broaden our understanding of the mind?
Well, they argued that instead of just searching for these universal laws of behavior psychology, needed to consider the profound ways in which gender, along with other social factors, like race, culture, socioeconomic status, those things influence our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
So it's like recognizing that there isn't just one map for everyone, but rather this diverse tapestry of maps, reflecting a multitude of lived experiences.
Precisely. Feminist psychologists not only critique existing research, but they also conducted new studies exploring topics that had been largely neglected.
Like what?
Things like women's health relationships and experiences of discrimination. And this in turn paved the way for a more inclusive and nuanced understanding of the human experience.
It's amazing to see how psychology, when it embraces these diverse perspectives, can create a richer and more accurate map of the human experience.
And this journey of discovery, it extends beyond gender. Research on the psychology of minority groups has also really challenged this idea of a universal psychology, revealing how our understanding of the mind has often been shaped by a narrow, typically Western-centric perspective.
It's like comparing maps from different cultures and realizing that the very symbols, landmarks, even their ways of representing space can vary dramatically.
Exactly. For example, studies of indigenous cultures have shown that their conceptions of the self, their ways of understanding relationships, even their definitions of mental health, can differ significantly from the dominant Western models.
It's a good reminder that our assumptions about the mind, even those that are really deeply ingrained in our culture, might not be universally applicable.
Precisely. This realization, it calls for humility, a willingness to learn from other cultures, and a recognition that our understanding of the mind, it's constantly evolving as we encounter new perspectives.
It's like acknowledging that the map of the human mind is still being charted with vast territories yet to be explored. And speaking of exploration, this brings us to a fascinating aspect of psychology that I think is often overlooked. How psychological knowledge is used not just by experts, but by everyday people in their daily lives.
Right. You're talking about what some researchers call folk psychology.
Yes.
Those everyday psychological concepts that we all use to make sense of ourselves, others, the world around us.
Exactly. It's like we've all become amateur psychologists in a way,
Yeah.
using psychological terms to explain behavior, make judgments, navigate our relationships.
Right. Think about how often you hear phrases like, he's just stressed, or she's got a type A personality, or they need to work on their communication skills. These are all examples of folk psychology in action.
That's true. It's fascinating how these psychological concepts have really permeated our language and our thinking, but can this reliance on folk psychology sometimes lead us astray?
Oh, absolutely. While folk psychology can be helpful in navigating our social world, it can also lead to, oversimplifications, misinterpretations, even harmful stereotypes.
Right.
For example, we might assume that someone's behavior is solely driven by their personality, overlooking the powerful influence of social context, the cultural norms, or even just having a bad day.
It's a good reminder that people are more complex than our quick judgments might suggest.
Right. We should be cautious about, you know, labeling people or jumping to conclusions about their motivations.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to the importance of critical thinking, a skill that's more essential than ever in today's world, where we're constantly bombarded with psychological information, both accurate and misleading.
It's true. So how can we become more discerning consumers of psychological information?
Yeah.
How can we apply that critical lens to the psychological concepts we encounter, whether it's in the news, on social media, or even in our own conversations?
It's a great question. How can we do that?
Well, it starts with curiosity, I think, with asking questions, challenging assumptions. Don't just accept psychological claims at face value,
Huh.
especially if they're reinforcing stereotypes or offering really simplistic solutions to complex problems.
Right.
Remember that the human mind is incredibly intricate, and our understanding of it is constantly evolving.
It's like approaching psychology with a sense of wonder and a healthy base of skepticism, always seeking a deeper understanding.
Exactly. Be open to different perspectives. Consider the sources of information, and be willing to change your mind as new evidence emerges. Psychology is an ongoing conversation, a journey of discovery, and you are an active participant in that journey.
What a fascinating deep dive. We've journeyed through the entire history of psychology, from its philosophical roots to the rise of scientific methods, from the fervor of behaviorism to the complexities of the cognitive revolution. And we've explored how social forces have shaped the field and how psychology in turn continues to shape our understanding of ourselves and the world.
And as you continue to encounter psychological concepts in your everyday life, remember that the quest to understand the human mind is ongoing. Ask questions, challenge assumptions, and never stop exploring. The most fascinating discoveries are often just around the corner.
Subscribe now.